So one of the things that you may get exposed to when you're working in web development is this idea of infrastructure as code. And that's basically you write code and that code is used for deploying out your cloud services and making sure your servers are running, making sure your application gets deployed all automatically through a single deployment process. Now in all my projects, one of the most important tool that I have used is something called Terraform, which I'll kind of give a quick overview in this video. I'm not going to go do like a deep dive, but I think just exposing you to it could be something that's useful to understand. So Terraform is a tool that lets you basically write infrastructure as code tool and then get it deployed out to, for example, Amazon or GCP or other cloud providers, right? They have like different providers that hook into these different cloud services. And then you can just kind of like run some scripts and get everything deployed out. So the most basic way to get started is make a folder and then go ahead and put like a main.tf. TF is what the extension name is for Terraform. And there is an extension that you can use for Terraform that makes like the syntax highlighting a little bit better. Okay, so inside the main TF file, this is where you can start defining Terraform code. And we're going to start with a simple AWS provider here. So if you go to the Terraform documentations, they have providers. And you'll see they have like stuff for Azure, Google Cloud Platform, Kubernetes, etc. I'm going to be using AWS because that's kind of what I'm familiar with. But inside of this, they give you kind of an example of how you can set up to get your Terraform deployment working with the AWS provider. All right, so we are actually going to grab these two right here, and I should be able to just copy and paste them into any Terraform file. I usually just put them in main, or you can make like a providers.ts. Okay, so now that we have the provider set up, once you have this provider, it allows you to start using different definitions here. So like if I were to type in AWS S3 bucket, we can find a resource here. And the resource, basically, you can just define it in your code like this to spin up an Amazon S3 bucket. So like do here, I'm going to go ahead and just define a bucket here. I'll say like my bucket. And then over here, you can call this whatever you want. And then for tags, I don't want to tag this. I'm just going to keep it as simple as possible. So this is like the bare minimum Terraform file that defines some providers that this code's going to use, what region you want to get deployed to, and then also the bucket you want to spin up. So now that you have that, inside your terminal down here, you can cd into the info folder, and then you can see I'm in that directory. But also you need to have a CLI command installed called Terraform. I'm a little bit out of date, but we're going to go ahead and just keep rolling with my older out-of-date software. So once you're in that directory, you can say Terraform init. And what this does is it's going to look through this directory and try to find all of your .tf files. And it basically just runs them together. Now you can also have like subdirectories if you want to have like Terraform modules and stuff, but this is how you can initialize your Terraform project like this. And you'll see it creates a .terraform folder. And inside of that folder, you will see there's a Terraform provider AWS. So like if I were to go ahead and show this, you'll see the AWS provider, which is brought in because of this block. Okay, so the Terraform init looks through your files. It starts pulling in third-party modules. It starts pulling in providers. And then you can actually plan. So I'm going to say Terraform plan. And that is going to, again, look through all your Terraform code. And it determines what does it need to do on your cloud provider of choice when this thing is ran. So like right now, I don't have any resources deployed out via Terraform onto S3 or onto AWS, I mean. So it's going to try to create an S3 bucket. And then here are some of the things that it's going to modify on that bucket when I were to apply this plan. Okay, so now I can actually just say Terraform apply after I kind of look through this and says, okay, it's going to add one resource. The reason we kind of do the plan is because sometimes you will make changes to your Terraform code and then it's going to try to delete resources, which can be very problematic because like let's say an RDS database instance, you change something in Terraform things that needs to delete your RDS instance. You want to know that before you run the code. So it's good to do the plan. It kind of like lets you know what's going to happen. You can read through this. All right, so now that we have the plan, which you can actually have it be outputted to a director if you want to. So like, I don't know, plan.txt. Okay, so that'll do the same thing, but now there's an actual like plan.txt, which has like a bunch of arbitrary like binary code in it. And this is used to tell Terraform like how to get all these things deployed out. But anyway, having the plan file is not necessary. Like you can actually just say Terraform apply. And so this is the actual command that's going to take your changes and apply them to your AWS account. So I'm going to go ahead and just like put some random numbers on here so I don't have a unique naming collision, and I'll just do an apply. And then it's going to ask you, are you sure you want to apply this? I will say yes. And then we should hopefully see it create the bucket for us. And it did. It said 1 added. And I did have to like append some random numbers. If there's already a bucket with the same name, you might get some obscure errors. Anyway, so that's the idea. So it ran, everything worked fine. And so if we go to AWS S3, you will see my bucket. It's right there. It created my bucket for me. Cool. So we have our first Terraform script that created that resource. And then also when you run it, it's going to create something called a state file. So like a TF state file. This is what it uses to track like what it currently thinks is deployed to AWS, so that it can take your state and compare it against the code that you might be modifying and changing. And so it knows how to go to AWS and apply those changes. Now on a larger project, you should probably have your state file stored in an S3 bucket. There's ways to basically configure this to store the state remotely, just in case you have a CI/CD pipeline that runs like Terraform twice. You want that state centralized so that, these different runners can pull the state before it tries to do its logic to figure out what it needs to deploy out. And then also there's something called a lock record that you can set up with like AWS DynamoDB if you want to. Again, so like if you have like multiple people push to their PR at the same time or merge their stuff at the same time, you don't want multiple Terraform runners to try to destroy or create stuff in your AWS account at the same time. So you need a lock file. But for a very small project, you can actually just have this stuff kind of run locally if you want to. You like to live on the edge. All right, let's go back to the documentation about this resource that we created. Okay, so we have a resource, and it turns out there's a lot of ways that you configure this, because if you've actually like dived through the S3 dashboard, like you'll notice that there's a lot of tabs, a lot of configuration, which leads us to the main point of Terraform, is that you can configure your whole bucket based on passing arguments in code. So like you can change a bucket prefix, you can add in ACLs if you want to, change the security rules, you can do a CORS rule, you can add in logging to the bucket, etc. So let's try to modify this a little bit more. So like you could potentially find other attributes to pass to this thing. But it turns out that a lot of these things are actually kind of like deprecated. Like if you look through all these, they don't really want you to configure your buckets with these attributes. So let's check out versioning. Versioning is one thing that you can attach to your bucket, right? So let's do AWS bucket versioning and look at an example here. And basically, if you just take this example, you should be able to attach another resource to your bucket you just created, and it'll attach a versioning on it. But the way this works for this resource is it takes in a bucket attribute. So you need to actually point it to the bucket we just created. And the way that you can reference other resources, you basically just do the resource name dot the actual descriptor name, so my bucket, dot an output from this resource. So I guess one thing I should talk about, which I haven't mentioned, is that when you create a resource, you actually have like a bunch of outputs that come from that thing. So like you can actually get information about the resource that was just created, such as the ID, the zone ID, the ARN if you want to. That's kind of an important one. So we can actually grab the ID of our bucket and pass it as a value for this bucket attribute that exists on the versioning example. So like the easiest way to think about Terraform, these resources, they're basically functions. You have like named functions. This is like the name of your function. You have like a custom label for that thing that you're creating. And then you have input. So all these arguments, you can actually pass in a bunch of random stuff into this thing that you're trying to create. And then once you've created it, you get a bunch of outputs from that function. So kind of like the thing that gets returned from this resource. And so you can chain on. The way Terraform kind of works under the hood is like there's an implicit dependency chain, or dependency graph, I guess you could call, where this thing implicitly depends on this thing being created. So Terraform is smart enough to figure out that dependency graph, and it's actually going to start creating things in order. So it'll create this bucket first, and when this is done, it can get the ID, it'll start creating the bucket versioning to enable versioning on that bucket. So just to try that out, again, we can go down here and say Terraform plan, and that'll tell us what it thinks needs to be changed with our AWS infrastructure. Okay, and right now it's saying we should probably just create a versioning record and put it on the bucket. So again, like we can do an apply, and we will probably have to say yes to have it add versioning to the bucket. And now it is updated. So if we go back to our AWS resource and click it, there should be in properties, there should be like a versioning. Okay, and I'll click edit, and now it's enabled. Before it was not enabled, and now it's enabled. All right, what else can I talk about in Terraform? So like with these resources, you can actually specify lifecycle rules. So like let's say you never want this bucket to accidentally delete. Like for example, if I were to change and put another character here, and then do a Terraform plan, I want you to watch what happens. Terraform is going to look at that and think that it needs to delete that bucket and recreate a brand new one. This is the problem with Terraform, is that if you're not careful and you change an attribute, Terraform will decide, you know what, I need to destroy your bucket, I need to destroy your versioning example, and then I need to recreate new ones with a new ID. That's the biggest gotcha. There are random attributes that exist on different things, like incognito. There's certain properties that if you change, Terraform's going to go ahead and just delete everything, which means it could wipe out all your data, it could wipe out all your users, it could wipe out your database. And so there's certain lifecycle rules you need to put in place if you want to make sure that like stuff never gets deleted. Luckily, buckets can't be deleted unless they're like completely empty. So there's a safeguard with that. RDS instances, again, they have like a prevent delete property you can add to the actual database instance. So like even if Terraform thinks it needs to delete the bucket or delete the database, it's not going to do it. But for other resources, like if Terraform thinks it needs to be deleted, it'll delete it. So let's do a lifecycle here. And I can just go ahead and say prevent destroy of true. So now if I were to go ahead and like try to replan this, I think it's going to still think it needs to delete the resources. But the difference is it's going to say instance cannot be destroyed, which is great because now when you try to apply the plan, it won't touch those resources. So this is a pretty good safeguard. There's also other rules where you can like tell it to ignore different changes, which I'm not going to dive into that one. So, okay, so that is the gist. But now let's say you wanted to actually have different environments on your AWS account. This is very common where you have like a dev environment, a test environment, a production environment. Some people will actually make a completely separate AWS account for every single environment and keep all these things isolated. That's probably the safest approach and like the most secure approach because you don't want lower environments affecting the running status of your prod environment, okay? But just to show you, I can actually go over here and make another file and I'll just call this variables. Technically, this could actually be directly in the main.tf. One thing you'll learn about Terraform is like everything in the directory is what defines the module. So you can kind of put things wherever you want. It makes refactoring pretty easy. Like I could actually cut this out and put it over here if I want to. It'll work perfectly the same way. The naming is just like a convention that we use as humans. Terraform doesn't care. It just looks at the entire folder. It'll glue stuff together based on that. So anyway, we have a variables file. Let's say we wanted to append a environment suffix or a prefix to the bucket name. So I can actually say variable and I'll say environment. And then you can say type of string, and you could like give it a description if you wanted to. You can make it default to something like this. So now that I have this variable, the next time I try to run a Terraform plan, it's going to ask me, hey, what do you want this environment variable to be? Since I defaulted it, I don't think it'll ask. So I'm going to go ahead and try this. I'm going to run a plan just to show you. And it's going to ask you, what do you want environment to be set to? So I could type in dev, I could type in test. And then when I actually like run that, which I'm not going to do right now, it'll use that value. So now that I have the environment value, I can simply interpolate it like this. So now that it'll create a bucket with that environment suffix on it. And this is good because typically you want to attach some type of unique identifier to multiple AWS resources. So like buckets or your database, especially if you plan to have like multiple deployments on the same AWS account. But let's try running this. So now I can go over here and just say a Terraform plan. It's going to ask me what I want to deploy. I'll say dev. And then it should create a plan. It's going to delete my buckets. Okay, so it's going to try to destroy my buckets, and then it's going to recreate some new resources with hopefully that suffix. So as you can see here, Terraform saw a change with the bucket name. And it says that the old bucket name used to be this, the new bucket name is going to become this, and then it gives you a nice little descriptor of saying, hey, this is going to force this whole resource to be destroyed and replaced. All right, so that's what we want. So let's just go ahead and say Terraform apply now. And then again, it's going to ask me what environment variable. Okay, let's just do a dev again. And now that's going to go through and try to delete the bucket and then recreate the new one. If I say yes, let's just let this kind of go through. And eventually it'll delete the existing bucket that we're on. If I refresh, this should just error out now because it deleted the old bucket. This one no longer exists, right? It got deleted. But if I were to go up here and put a -dev on the bucket, it'll find the new bucket name. Okay, so we basically just told Terraform to delete the bucket, create a new bucket, put a environment suffix on the bucket name. All right, we just learned about how Terraform variables work. You can also do outputs. So like if you wanted to, for example, print out the ARN of this bucket when your Terraform code is done running, you can do this. We'll say output and we'll say like bucket ARN. And then we should be able to reference again that resource that's in that same directory. We can reference the ARN and just have this thing be printed out for us. This is useful when you want to basically take outputs of Terraform and pipe it into other things in your CI/CD process. So like if you have a GitHub action that needs to run Terraform, and then you have more commands after Terraform runs, where you need to pull out ARNs or pull out endpoints, domains, URLs, whatever, you can do that. So now that we actually have outputs, you can see it's going to try to add an output definition here. So let's just go ahead and apply this again. I'll say dev, and then it should hopefully run. I'll say yes to approve it. And then down here at the bottom, you'll see the output. We get the whole bucket ARN. And so you can pass this into something like a grep or JQ or something and extract this ARN if you want to. There's also something called Terraform output. And then I can actually get that now. So I can say this should be bucket ARN, I think. And so if I run this, I will get the actual string that I can use later on in like a bash script or some other process if I need to like link stuff together, which is very common when you have like a larger project with a bunch of Terraform code. Okay, so we learned about variables, we learned about outputs, and you know, sometimes it's nice to just put this in a different outputs.tf file. Again, the file naming doesn't really matter. So the very last thing I'm going to talk about in this video, I mean, there's like a ton of stuff I could probably keep diving into Terraform, is modules. So sometimes you want to split your code up into smaller folders. So like you can make a folder here called like, I don't know, bucket. And then inside of this, you can actually take the bucket definition. I'm going to cut this out. I'm going to go over here to say like testing.tf. Again, the naming does not matter. What matters is the directory location. And what happens when you do this is that the entire bucket kind of gets isolated from these other files. So I'm going to go ahead and move variables in here. I'm going to move outputs in here, and I'm going to go back to main. And then we can actually import that module. I could say module bucket. You can name this whatever you want. The important part is you point to it. So I'm going to say source, and I want this to point to that bucket directory. And then we need to pass in the environment variable that came from the variables, which I deleted. So we actually have to put that variables back, and I'll put the outputs back real quick. Okay, so again, that kind of demonstrated that the variables inside of this is separate. It's kind of like you're defining your function or your module, and you're saying, here are the variables that are needed for this module. Here are the outputs that will happen for this module. Now, the main difference now is we have this stuff being created. We don't have to change this. But if you look at the outputs, this is going to be outputting the bucket ARN. But if I look at the outputs here, I won't be able to grab access to this thing. Like, this is not the proper value location. In fact, if I just ran this for you all to show you that this is wrong, let's do a plan again. And I think this will just crash, right? It cannot find this bucket. So let's first of all do a Terraform init. When you have modules, you do have to like initialize them so Terraform knows how to like grab them and put them in this directory. Kind of interesting. But now you'll see in the Terraform folder, you have like modules, and it grabbed in some modules JSON, which kind of describes that module. Anyway, so now that we did the init, let's go back and do the plan. We'll do dev, and then we should see an error. Okay, this output is trying to reference a non-existing module. So the difference is now, instead of trying to access the value of this resource, which doesn't exist at this top level anymore, we can say module dot bucket ARN. And so this output is actually going to reference the output of the module. Okay, so you can make different modules. You can tie them all together. You can have one module depend on the output of other modules. So like I could have like actual like multiple modules here. If I wanted to run this, and then I could like change the different environment or like a prefix or like configuration for that module independently. I know there's a lot of information. I'm kind of like jumping all over the place, but I just want to give a quick overview of Terraform. I think it's important to understand this if you want to become like a DevOps engineer. Okay, so this worked fine. Again, we just move some stuff around, and when you do that, Terraform sometimes thinks that it needs to destroy everything and recreate it. So instead of allowing Terraform to destroy this stuff, we should actually probably do some type of like Terraform move. So how do we resolve this? We move the bucket definition into a module, and now Terraform wants to like delete my bucket, which isn't good because I could have like a bunch of stuff in that bucket, real user data, and I don't want that to be ever destroyed. So we just need to kind of tell Terraform like, hey, this thing actually just got moved. So when you try to run, just reconfigure like your state so that we can figure out like where stuff needs to live. One way you can do it in the command line, you say Terraform state move, and then you can say the name of what you had and like where it moved. And so typically over here in the first section, you'd actually put like the old resource. So I could say like AWS S3 bucket, my resource, I'll paste that in there. And then on the right, you say module dot, what do we call it? We called it bucket dot, and then inside the module, you want to put the AWS resource. So we'll say this, and then in my bucket. So this will tell Terraform state that, hey, like, don't worry about deleting this thing. Like, it's just moved to a new location. Same thing with the versioning. You'll probably have to do the same thing here. Let's run this. And then it says successfully moved one object. And then we're going to do the same thing with the bucket versioning. So I'm going to go ahead and just do this. And then we will move, let me make sure I grab this. We're going to move it exactly to the same location over here. So let's just go ahead and grab the versioning. Go ahead and grab the versioning, and then I'll grab this. I forgot a double quote. All right, there we go. And so now that moved the versioning definition as well. So now we should be able to do a Terraform plan, and it should know that like these resources are still deployed out. It just internally knows where they live in the Terraform state. Okay, so we could go ahead and just do a apply now, I believe. Keep doing dev. By the way, the inputs I keep typing out by hand, like you can actually pass them as CLI arguments. You can also just export stuff on your shell. I think it just needs to be like a prefix of export, TF, env, and then you do like environment is equal to dev. Check the syntax on that. I don't know if that's truly the right syntax, but that's kind of how it is. If that exists on your shell when you run this, Terraform will automatically grab that and parse it and put it as your inputs, which is how I kind of do it on my projects. All right, so this worked fine. It didn't need to destroy anything because obviously all we did was we moved some stuff around. Why would it have to destroy resources because I moved some files? This is how you can achieve it. You can use the command line CLI tool to do that type of stuff. Another way you can do it is actually inside of Terraform itself. You can put this moved command, and you can actually specify what you had before and where you're moving it to. That's a pretty good approach. After you do a successful plan, I believe that'll already update your like Terraform state, and then you can kind of like remove it. So it's like a temporary thing you just do. You have to do deployment with it, and you should be good. I kind of like this approach better than the CLI, but it's up to you. All right, so at this point, you are a Terraform expert. You understand how to use Terraform, how to set up inputs and outputs and variables, how to actually define modules and invoke them, how we could set up different resources like an S3 bucket, give it a prefix. We can add additional configurations to these resources. There are a ton of these resources, so you'd have to actually scroll through. For every AWS service, they have Terraform providers / resources you can use. There's a lot more about Terraform I haven't talked about. Like there's a data block. If you want to actually like have your Terraform run, look on your AWS account and pull information in. You can do that with a data block. You can actually have like variables defined inside of resources. So like if you want to have like a hard-coded list of static configuration like constants, you can actually do that. Define some constants I can use. I forget what the name of it is called. Yeah, it's called locals. Okay, so locals is basically where you can define like a bunch of local variables. And like if I wanted to use these now, I could simply just go here and say locals dot, and then I should be able to access that bucket name. So like here's locals, and then I'm going to access the bucket name down there or something. Technically this should have been bucket suffix. Okay, so this is good because you want to have like a bunch of constants defined someplace, like a single place, like you could do it there. There's also like inline string manipulation techniques you can use in Terraform. So like you could actually like have this thing be forced to be all lowercase, or you could like do substrings and stuff directly into that, but that's more advanced. I'm not going to talk about that. Yeah, I'm not really sure. I guess leave a comment if there's anything else that you want me to talk about, but I think what I showed right here is like enough to hit the ground running with using Terraform to deploy stuff to your AWS account. And of course, AWS costs money. So like when you're done experimenting, you can do a Terraform destroy, and that's going to go through all of your stuff that you have deployed out, and it's going to go ahead and just tear it down for us, right? And all right, so we got the little plan here. It's going to try to destroy two things. Let's just say, yes, I want you to destroy everything because I don't want to get charged for those buckets. And now when I refresh, this should be gone, and I will not get charged for any of the resources that I had up. All right, that was your Terraform speed run. I know there's a ton more that goes into Terraform, so leave a comment if there's anything you want me to maybe dive into and make another video of. Also, if you guys like the DevOps type of stuff, leave a comment and I'll try to make more of this. I don't really know if you guys do. A lot of my subscribers like the web dev, Next.js, building UIs and backends. But the DevOps world's kind of a separate thing that's also important to know about when it comes to web development if you're like a full stack engineer or a DevOps engineer. But yeah, I guess I just don't know if you guys enjoy watching it. All right, have a good day and happy coding. And like always, I have a Discord channel you guys can join if you want to find a place to kind of hang out, to ask me questions. Sometimes I'm on there and I respond to people. But yeah, Discord's in the description, link below.